A Vox officer clambered over the bulkhead door into the Situation Room, holding up a Vox transcript. "Sir, Admiralty just reported in. Seems the idiots actually tried it. Operation is clear to go." The officer saluted, handing it over. The aging Vice Admiral opened it up, humming as he read it over, chuckling. "Well then, you know what to do, boys. Let's show them how we in the Silent Service get things done," he said, a devious glint in his eye as he got up, folding up the paper and placing it in his pocket. "Sir, yes, sir," echoed out throughout the ship, even as the ship herself let out an echoing, quiet laugh, her engine ring glowing as she pushed herself forward. Just inside the orbit of the Ink homeworld, a large, heavily pressurized gas giant with solid land masses floating around, a large, upscaled Gatto-class shaped starship, slipped out of Vol space, with not even a ripple of a gravitational wavefront to be detected. Her free impulse drives glowing softly, as the Vol drive retracted into its ring shroud, located midships, rather than near the tail, close to a hull, allowing her to have a more streamlined appearance. Active and passive stealth systems kept her off scanners, like a piece of rock falling from orbit, her trajectory adjusted to match what her sensor shadow was designed to match, disguising her and keeping hostile scanners from picking her out. Calmly, she drifted through the gaseous cloud layers before anchoring herself in the upper layers of the floating landmasses. Her spherical series of inner hulls connected to one another to allow for use throughout the ship, keeping her crew nice and safe, even as the Vice Admiral had a hard time picking volunteers, not because there were so few, but because there were so many, despite the danger of the mission. Much as he wanted to join in on the fun, he was needed on the ship itself, and kept an eye out for trouble. Besides, he would have his chance as they left. A small, spherical ship exited the lower hangar, acting like a moon pool for the larger ship, followed by a second, and then a third, with 3 crewmen per ship, small mechanical armature on them, designed for salvage or mining operations, but that wasn't their goal this time. While lightly, for them, armed, the little vessels carefully drifted onto the more heavily inhabited landmasses, attaching scuttling charges to them, ones large enough to punch holes in dreadnoughts and cruisers, and they were installing them on unarmored landmasses. They were careful to choose only the ones with military complexes on them. Bunkers, spaceports, hangars, things of that nature, even some of the warehouses, before they returned to the ship. They continued this on other landmasses, careful not to draw attention, puzzled by the lack of anti-aircraft batteries, defenses, or the things of those natures. Did they really think that they could rely solely on the ship pressure of the gas giant they inhabited for defense? Granted, it was a good defense. Most ships weren't made for it, and most species picked paths of least resistance for colonization, but, well. Let it be said humanity didn't take harsh environments as a challenge. Hell, it was a ludicrous business to live on a gas giant, as humanity used them, more often than not, as massive forge worlds, the heat and pressures allowing them to forge durable metals and armors by simply lowering to an appropriate depth, and working metals there into the needed shape, before slowly raising them back up to allow them to temper and quench in the cooler currents. Most species saw it as insane, but couldn't deny how cheap it let humans make some of the more protective metal hulls needed for their ships, as opposed to making a foundry specifically for it. And as of that mission, that meant that humanity was uniquely suited to bring the fight to the Ink on their own homeworld, and were taking advantage of that fact with a will. The ship silently landed on another landmass, high above the populated ones below, taking advantage of its shape to hide their ship, as the smaller ships continued their work, planting scuttling charges on the underside of military posts, before they returned to the main vessel once more. During this time, however, they had taken the time to also plant charges on the underside of the communications array on the island, ready to topple it into the gaseous abyss below them, roiling and frothing aggressively. Once its landing mission was complete, and the smaller vessels were back, it began Phase 2 of the mission, and arguably the more fun part. Rising out of the clouds, the ship turned towards one of the orbiting shipyards, her soul humming in anticipation. Her amber on her command bridge and gave the command. Disengage silent running on the torpedo tubes. Run at the primaries. In that moment, she ceased to be a simple rock on the Ing's sensor relays, alarms screaming all throughout the station as her engines blazed to full power, pushing her towards the enemy station, the light of the sun catching her bow, revealing her name, the Barb, along with her mascot next to it, a barb fish with a cartoonish naval hat and red dynamite sticks in its fins. Her sides popped open a little, barrels extending, as her armor plates pushed outwards, revealing to be the tops of shrouded turrets, as the top of her slowly moved up, revealing a large forward cannon, while a similar one pushed out the top and bottom sections just behind the vol ring, aimed in reverse, if smaller. Sections by her conning tower opened up, revealing missile arrays, while her 4 large torpedo tubes opened up, aimed directly at the Ing shipyard. AA turrets unfolded out of additional parts of her hull on her side, twisting, hunting for fighters and smaller craft. Already panicking about a hostile warship suddenly on sensors behind their station, their sensor forces scrambled to ready positions, pouring out of the station in a blind panic, only for the Barb to use them for target practice. Her missile array screamed, releasing a swarm of missiles, arcing, turning and adjusting their aim to the smaller vessels, hissing towards them like snakes, weaving side to side, slamming into them before the small ships could safely get away from their allies to deploy countermeasures. The station itself slowly tried to spin around to get its main cannons in a good firing position, even as the Barb fired 2 large torpedoes into the black. Moments after they left the vessel, their hybrid rocket motors ignited, burning a bright, specifically designed mix that bathed the Barb harmlessly in fire as they raced towards the shipyard, before splitting in half, the lower half of the torpedoes splitting into more pieces, revealing hundreds of smaller missiles, and even the housing of the hundreds of smaller missiles kept burning towards the station, acting like chaff, filling the sensors of the shipyards with signatures, all racing towards the station, the forward half of the torpedoes igniting their hybrid motors, continuing their increasing speed. The Ing's ADS systems blazed, trying to destroy as many of the missiles as it could, but there were so many they couldn't get them all, and in fact many missiles targeted them, destroying them, clearing the path for the larger torpedoes, allowing them to impact the shipyard and detonate, engulfing the station in nuclear fire, scattering half-built ships, complete ships, debris, and station arms in every direction. Just as the fragmented remains of the fleet that had tried to attack New Terra dropped in to discover the burning remains of their station, and the hungry silhouette of the Barb against their homeworld, her cannons being brought to bear on them. "Sir, new contacts on sensors. Looks like the leftovers arrived," one of the crew said, as the Admiral chuckled. "Good to hear they left us a few snacks. All right, boys, just how we used to. Full ahead," he said, feeling his possessive girl smirking as she snarled. How true the old superstitions were. Afraid she would come back to cause havoc. He slowly settled into his chair, leaning back as the crew all synced with their vessel, settling into a protective embrace, even as her impulse drive screamed. Cannon crews worked in sync, loading shells as fast as she could fire them, the Barb shuddering as 5 of her cannons barked, the main forward cannon and 4 turret cannons, shells impacting and shattering the gouged, charred hulls, breaking up massive ships as she charged forward. The moment she was amongst the enemy vessels, her ADS systems lit up, lashing out as they shelled the cruisers and destroyers, her RCS impulse engines twisting her out of the way of enemy weapons, her shield shrugging off other shots, even as her missile bays gushed out more missiles, freshly loaded into the tubes by her crews with startling efficiency. Her crew bared their teeth as the enemy fleet attempted to ram her, only to slam into one another as she outflew them, her rear-facing cannons opening fire, propelling her forward a little as the 2 smaller cannons spat out the HE shells, detonating inside the enemy vessel hulls and blowing them apart again. The Barb threw herself around, burning retrograde, bearing down on the largest vessel in the enemy fleet, snarling hungrily as she felt all 4 of her torpedo tubes getting loaded up with their special surprise, her sensor crews scanning for active weapon systems in the remains of the station, the enemy vessels, looking for movement, electricity, anything, her ADS searching for new, weakened targets like vultures, before the ink vessel had a moment to get their bearings. The planet behind the barb lit up like a fireworks show. All of the scuttling charges set off, and went off in unison. An unintended side effect, however, was that the atmosphere of the gas giant was apparently highly unstable, and acted like a localized airfuel explosive, detonating massive, continent-sized areas as the charges went off, not just scuttling the islands, but blowing them to pieces, sending the surrounding islands flying away in the concussive blast, rings of fire visible from orbit from the various epicenters, making the barb look more horrifying than before. Granted, it wasn't very much, considering the sheer size of the planet, but the destruction was all visible from the low orbit they were in, and it practically covered the immediate area that was visible. And then she fired, spitting 4 torpedoes out, 2 of them rocketing forward faster, being shorter, detonating halfway between the barb and the ink vessel, releasing fire and chaff, blocking sensors. This allowed her to engage her vol engine as she dove into the fireball behind the torpedoes, using it to disguise her push into vol space. Right as she left, the 2 larger torpedoes raced through the fireball, aimed at the massive vessel, and dragging the fireball behind them. Revealing the barb's disappearing act, terrifying the ink crew, just before their ADS system tried to shoot the torpedoes out of the black, failing due to their still scrambled systems, and allowing the 2 torps to impact and detonate, blowing the massive vessel apart, more smaller pieces than the station. And left the remaining survivors to tell the story, in the remains of the vessels around them, of the horrifying ship that had been waiting for them, on top of the fleet that had waited for them partway to New Terra. Maybe they should have listened to the Council.